Who is the rightful authority to determine whether children are getting a proper education? A child's parents or the state? That's the question at the heart of an ongoing battle between New York City and state authorities on the one hand and ultra-Orthodox yeshivas or Jewish schools on the other. I'm Bill McGurn from the Wall Street Journal, and welcome to Deep Dive. Several years ago, a group of former yeshiva students claimed that these schools were not providing students with the basic secular education they need to get on in life. In 2015, Mayor Bill de Blasio promised an investigation. But the investigation looked like it stalled, and now the state has stepped in with proposals to regulate the school curricula. It's not only the yeshivas that are worried. Catholic schools in New York are also leery about the state intrusion. Some argue that such regulation is overreach, and some argue that it's long overdue. With me today to discuss are Michael Rebell, an expert in education law, professor at Teachers College at Columbia University, and an adjunct professor of Columbia Law School. Naftuli, founder and executive director of Young Advocates for Fair Education, an organization dedicated to improving the educational curricula within what are called the ultra-Orthodox schools, or yeshivas. And Dov Hikind, a former New York State Assemblyman who now serves as chairman of the Alliance for a Positive America. Thank you all for being here, gentlemen. Naftuli, let's start with you, since your organization really kicked off the whole issue. Can you tell us what you did and why and where we are today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So it's important for your viewers to understand really what's happening, because a lot of people have misconceptions. They think the state is unduly intruding into private school matters. What's really happening is that in some of these schools, kids are really not receiving a basic education. And when we say basic, we mean really basic. Right. So to give you a rundown, in most Hasidic boys, elementary and middle schools, children receive only 90 minutes of secular instruction, and it happens at the end of the day. So all day from like 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., they receive only Judaic studies instruction, and it happens in Yiddish for the most part. And then at 3:30 p.m. till about 5 p.m., they receive a little bit of secular education, and it usually just consists of basic English and arithmetic. So this is in elementary and middle school. In high school, boys get cut off completely from secular education, so from approximately bar mitzvah. At that point, their school days actually get much longer. They attend yeshiva from approximately 6:30 a.m. They go till 8:30 p.m., but the only thing they study is Judaic studies, and again, in Yiddish. No secular education whatsoever. No English, no math, no science, no social studies. I was
reading your report. It struck me, it was interesting. You say in the girls it's a little bit different. And the irony is of these schools, it seems from your point of view, the girls' schools are more woke than the boys' schools, right? In terms of at least teaching some of these secular subjects.
Well, if you understand why right. The boys are the ones who are not receiving...
Because they can't be rabbis, right?
Right, so the boys, every single Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox boy is essentially destined and therefore groomed to grow up to be a rabbi. Right. Even though the community leaders know that ultimately 95% of them won't be rabbis, but that's totally unrelated. Every boy should be groomed for that possibility. The girls, on the other hand, they can't become rabbis, therefore they do receive much more secular education, and their days tend to be split half and half.
Right. So Michael, tell us, is this your read of the situation with the yeshivas in New York? Is this an accurate portrayal of the problem?
As far as I know, it is an accurate portrayal of the problem. But you know, Bill, what I'd like to do is respond to the question you posed when you opened up the session today. And you said the issue is who gets to control education, the parents or the state, essentially. That issue has been solved. It's not a question. The U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on this almost 100 years ago in a well-known case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. Right. And at that time, compulsory education was first coming into play in most states in the Union. So Oregon, the state that was involved in this case, had passed a law that said now we have compulsory education. Every kid has to go to the public schools. Right. Essentially, they're outlawing private schools. So that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court really issued what you might call a Solomonic decision. They split the baby, but the way they split it is they said parents have a liberty interest under the Constitution to send their kids to a religious school, whatever school they want. But at the same time, they said, the state has the authority to ensure that these schools prepare kids for good citizenship, words to that effect. So New York State, like most states in the Union, for years has had a statute that says the education in all private schools, religious, independent, whatever they are, has to be substantially equivalent to the basic education kids get in the public schools. So that's the legal
Of course, we'll get back to the law later. That decision also said the children are not just wards of the state, right?
Not that decision. Another one did, but
similar decision.
Yeah.
But in terms of, so where is it now in New York? You're familiar with education reform. Where does this rest? Because my impression is that Mayor de Blasio promised an investigation. A lot of people want an investigation, were dissatisfied with it. Reports that some of the yeshivas that were mentioned as having a problem didn't cooperate. So why is this becoming a bigger issue now?
It's becoming a bigger issue because the mayor did finally release the results of the preliminary investigation that they did, most of which backed up the picture that Naftuli painted. But also, what was very worrisome to me and many others looking at it, you had a good number of these yeshivas that wouldn't even cooperate. They wouldn't let the investigators from the New York City Department of Education enter their doors. So one has to assume that they're not providing much secular education, or they wouldn't be so secretive about it. And in the meantime...
I'm not so sure about that. The New York Catholic schools said they're not going to cooperate. And I think the Catholic schools do a pretty good job. They have a sort of 99% graduation rate for the high schools. So I don't think you can assume they're not doing a good job because they're not cooperating.
Well,
I think that's something that would have to be proved.
You may be right about that. But the other thing I'll tell you is we've had this law that I mentioned on the books for years about substantially equivalent. It's never been enforced. What's happened that's different is, as a result of these investigations, as a result of the information that Naftuli's group has put out, the state commissioner has now taken a position.
Commissioner of Education.
Yes, the Commissioner of Education has put out new guidelines and has indicated that the state is going to start enforcing this.
So, Dov, can you respond? I take it you have a different point of view. And tell us why it's more than just an issue for the Jewish community, or a percentage of the Jewish community that uses yeshivas.
Yeah. First of all, it's very important to understand that when you talk about yeshiva education, that is an extremely broad term. We're talking about all kinds of religious schools, from Hasidic, usually you'll identify them, people with beards and dressed a certain way, and other types of schools. I am personally a product of Hasidic schools. As a youngster, my father wanted me to go to, went to 2 different Hasidic yeshivas, and then my mother had a debate with my father that went on. It was pretty noisy in our home when I was a little kid. My mother wanted me to get more of a secular education. I was getting a secular education, but limited. My mother fought with my father. It was like the Chaim Potok, the Chosen, the 2 kids. And she wanted me to go to a school which is called Torah V'das, which was like the Harvard in those days for secular education. So people make choices. Let me just finish. People make
the ultra-Orthodox world.
People make choices, and I think it is extremely important that the state not come down with a rod, against Catholic schools and against yeshivas. I think the most critical thing is that there be a dialogue, that people work together. Everybody cares about their children. The parents care about the children. The institutions care about the children. And, the state, whatever that is, the state cares about the children. So there needs to be dialogue. There needs to be discussion. Can we do better? Of course we can do better. Can we do better in the public schools? I mean, look at the results.
It's a lot of kids, too, isn't it? I mean, I think the figure I have for the state is about 165,000, right? I think, and even in New York, what is it, 110,000 students we're talking about? That's larger than the Boston public school system, right? I mean, so it's a fairly large segment.
And not just that, it's also the fastest growing population, not just in New York, but probably in the United States. So, but I also want to set the record straight about these revised guidelines. So it's important to know that these guidelines have been in place for all these years, and they were pretty much similar to the so-called new guidelines that came out in November of 2018. The only thing is they weren't enforced. And the New York City Department of Education they kind of use the excuse that it's not thorough enough, it's not clear enough, so they can't properly enforce it, which is why the state, approximately 2 years ago, went ahead and began revising it to make it just crystal clear how it should be enforced. And it's kind of clear for both sides, the yeshivas or all non-public schools, as well as the state and the local district.
Weren't the guidelines themselves the definition of what is substantially equivalent, isn't that, or wasn't until recently, kind of fuzzy? Because, you were complaining, I know, in one of your articles that it had been distorted about the hours required. It hasn't really been defined precisely, has it?
The previous version of the guidelines had a pretty good Q&A section. And in it asked these questions. How many hours do non-public schools need to teach? And the response was, the answer was, well, there's no set amount of time, but it should be, again, substantially equivalent to public schools, which had 5 hours in elementary school and 5.5 hours in high school. In these yeshivas, we're talking about 1.5 hours in elementary and middle school and none in high school. So it was very clear that it wasn't substantially equivalent. It had another question, what subjects must be taught in non-public schools? And it listed a bunch of subjects that are required. And again, these are subjects that are taught in every public school, every non-public school, every Catholic school, and even in many Jewish schools, as Dov mentioned. But the problem is, in these yeshivas, maybe a fraction of these subjects were taught, if any at all.
I want to point out that the State Education Commissioner, going back a couple of months ago, came out with requirements that was so preposterous and so ridiculous. And when a commissioner comes out, basically, it would have meant that all these yeshivas would have to do secular education from 9 a.m. till 5 o'clock in the afternoon every day of the week. It made no sense. And you lose faith in government when government comes along with a rod.
Yeah, I don't have much to begin with.
But I'm saying this is actually what happened in the beginning. It made no sense. Everybody was saying, well, let me
she never said
this is what they came out with. And then, interesting, this is what they said publicly. This
they
is
didn't
our
say
commissioner.
8 hours a day.
The commissioner basically came out with the number of hours that would mean you wouldn't have any religious education. So, and that was changed. I'm not quite sure what it is now.
You tell me. Does that make sense that the government requires more secular education from private schools, from religious schools than public schools? No. It was a misunderstanding which they clarified.
It was a misunderstanding that went on for weeks.
You know what other misunderstanding no one had a problem with? That for 3 years, children were not getting any secular education, zero, and the yeshivas had no problem with that. And that, in fact, that's been going on for decades.
Let me just point out,
the point is,
representing these communities for 36 years, every Hasidic group, because that's what we're talking about. I went to so many science fairs, history, all kinds of things.
Has there ever been one in Yeshiva of Satmar, in Rebell, in Babiv, in Vizhnitz,
the
in
answer
New
is yes.
Square? Absolutely not. Please.
Wait. Are you calling me a liar? I went to a science fair of Babiv with 1,000 students. You just said Babiv. You're changing that. You just said Babiv.
Okay. Let's tell the audience what we're talking about. So within the Hasidic community, there are many different sects.
Right.
The vast majority follow the kind of practice that I've outlined. 90 minutes in elementary and middle school, only English and arithmetic, and 0 in high school. There are some Hasidic yeshivas, mostly on the fringe, but there's one that is kind of like a regular Hasidic sect that's pretty large that does provide a little more secular education. And on days,
which one is that?
And on days that the Assemblymen
is one of the largest ones.
And on days that the Assemblymen showed up, they put up a nice charade that they too teach secular education. This is a fact.
Okay, let me get into Michael.
Can I tell you something, Naftuli?
This is yeshiva graduates. They'll tell you.
Naftuli may mean well, but this is an example of what the problem is. He calls it. He just insulted all these people. He called it a charade.
In many cases, it's a charade.
Can you tell the audience on what basis you call it a charade? Tell us right now.
Will you stop?
Tell us right now why you call it a
Michael, I want to go to you.
Okay. I want to tell the audience, because when I was a kid, on days that the inspectors came, we had lunch that looked 10 times better than lunch that we got the day before or the day after. Not just that, on days that the inspectors came to check on the lunch or the breakfast, we had kids who normally wouldn't come in for breakfast. Suddenly they were brought in because their heads had to be counted too. When we got government tests, which happened only rarely, we received the answers from the teachers. So I can go on and on. I hear from the
let me bring Michael in. Tell me what this is doing to the politics. I mean, it's interesting, right, that it's sort of awoken a lot of communities that haven't been that political, and the city council, didn't they come out against? It's just making for interesting bedfellows, right?
The city council had a lot to do with initiating that investigation that the mayor did. And I want to say two things about that investigation, because first of all, it did substantially confirm the facts that Naftuli has put out about what was going on in the 18 or so schools that they actually visited, right. And then they said half of them wouldn't let them in. The other thing that the investigation indicated was that the city was willing to start negotiating with these schools, which I think Dov had indicated would be the ideal, and I think most reasonable people agree with that. And there was some progress that was made, in my mind insubstantial. I'll tell you why in a minute. But the commissioner's regulations also call for dialogue and discussion. They require local boards of education, like the New York City Board, to investigate what's going on in the schools. If they find that they're not meeting the regulations, the commissioner tells them you should enter into a discussion, a negotiation, to see whether you can work it out. It's only when the negotiations don't happen or they totally fail that it goes up to the commissioner to enforce it.
Well, tell me, on a slightly related question, apart from the math and English, there's some fear in these schools that what the state is really after is not just better math scores, but a different worldview. I mean, these schools have only male rabbis and so forth. Right. They're fairly socially conservative. I think the Catholic schools share that. If there's a problem with the few yeshivas, is the answer really to have this kind of thing? I mean, we talk about introducing a different worldview. No one ever talks about introducing a different worldview to the public schools. I mean, my kids went to Catholic grade school because I didn't like the worldview, right?
Well, when you say worldview, you've opened up the area of my greatest interest, to tell you the truth, which is the fact they don't teach social studies or civics at all, as far as I know, certainly in the yeshivas that were investigated. And I'm very concerned that many public schools and many private schools are not carrying out the traditional, traditional purpose of education,
the old-fashioned civics
which
courses,
is to prepare kids to be active citizens in a democratic society. And that has become a crisis issue in these times. We can get into it, but right. I think most people are very concerned about the state of our democratic institutions and young people's knowledge and ability to deal with that. So I've actually written a book saying the public schools are not doing enough in this area and laying out what needs to be done. Now, private schools, there are some private schools, including Catholic schools, that are models for how you teach democratic values and how you teach citizenship skills to kids. But there are many other private schools, whether they're Catholic, Jewish, or whatever, that are not doing a proper job. And I believe
but that's your measure, right?
Bill, I mean, yes.
I mean, that's the question I have. I asked you in some of the questions beforehand. I was pointing to the performance of New York State public schools. Most kids in New York are not doing English, math, or science at level. Most, the majority.
And
if you, so why are the people that are in charge of that, why should we put them in charge of the other schools? I mean, we have a similar related issue with the high-achieving schools where the mayor, it just seems, why would we trust the people that are not providing a decent education in the public schools to the majority of students to then go...
Bill, well, look, you're bringing up the whole issue of democratic legitimacy.
No, bringing up substantively equivalent. Would you accept the yeshiva system with 40% of the 45% of the kids passing? Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, look, what I will say to you, as I said, I'm most interested in what's going on in civics and in social studies. And in fact, the commissioner asked me to chair a regents committee that we're now looking into improving civic readiness in all schools in New York State, public and private. So that's where I'm coming from on this. And I think the authorities in New York are aware of this civic challenge, and they are trying to deal with it. And in my mind, what's going on in these yeshivas, it's an extension of that. These kids are going to be voters. And if you're going to be a voter in this country, you've got to have some background in what separation of powers means, what Congress's power are in different things.
But of course, it's the same city where we have 50 to 60,000 kids from really poor schools on a waiting list for charters. And overnight, if you gave them space, you could have them in better performing charter schools.
But again,
right?
it's very important to point something out here.
One second, Bill, you really hit the point. It's about trust. A lot of the schools, again, I want to make it clear. Can yeshivas do better? Absolutely. Can public schools do dramatically better, spending so much of our money, ridiculous amounts of money, and nothing really changes? Let me finish. The problem is, I find it interesting. I find it interesting with Mr. Rebell that it's all about, now it comes down, not about math, not about science, it comes down to social studies. Our kids in our yeshivas, let me tell you, they are sophisticated. They know what's going on. They do study. They do learn. Now, one school does less. Look, Naftuli had some bad experiences, quite obviously. I'm not familiar with those experiences. I went to Bell's as a kid. I went to Vishnitz. Those are Hasidic Yeshivas. I didn't have those horrible experiences.
Well, Dov, let me...
You did, and your picture, and it's colored. Everything is colored.
Well,
Accusations.
Let me ask you a question.
Look,
Dialogue is the answer, Naftuli.
And you know,
dialogue,
you remember when you were an assemblyman and I reached out to
Naftuli,
you? That was part of the dialogue.
Let me ask you something you raised.
On our part to have dialogue, but you and others weren't responsive, to be honest.
Let me ask a question that was in your report.
That you know
something that you raised, a different
issue. That is not true.
I need to respond to something.
To respond to one of his points in one of your reports. I mean, one of the arguments against the yeshivas, that report, is that by not preparing people in the secular world to make a living and so forth, you're making them disproportionately dependent on government subsidies, food stamps, Medicaid, and so forth. How do you respond to that? I mean, that's a hard argument, isn't it?
First of all, you can't argue with those numbers. The fact that so many people in these communities are dependent on government handouts. Right. But it's not connected to the education. People in our communities make choices. You know,
it's not just about family size.
Why don't people in our community have televisions? Right. They don't watch television. Why do people in our community, they're very careful in terms of the outside world because they want to protect the tradition. Right. And I respect that. You know, I have a different, outlook. They have a different outlook. But it's about respecting the cultural difference that exists between communities. It's about dialogue. It's about not making accusations, Naftuli. Naftuli, even today, you made accusations. You said things that you don't. You absolutely. It's all backed up. Well, you gave an example of an event that I went to. You said that was pre-planned just for Dov Hikind.
What I was saying
is, it's an event that's held every single year. But when you make accusations, you lose the audience. You lose the audience, Naftuli.
So I want to respond to a few points that were brought up. First of all, the comparison to public schools. It's very important. I tried doing that in my introduction. But remember, in public schools, they teach every subject that is required to be taught.
Apparently not well.
Well,
right?
Not well. That's a different ballgame.
If a majority of kids are not getting...
They're not performing at the level that we would like them to perform.
No, at their grade level.
Right.
They're failing,
but
basically.
Every child has... receives instruction in English and math and science and social studies.
But apparently it doesn't mean anything.
It means something for the kids who can perform, who want to perform better, who want to do better.
Less than half.
Here, in some of these yeshivas that we're talking about, it's simply not even an option. It's simply not taught. So that's one thing. You brought up the poverty, so I appreciate that. And the data shows that it's not only because of family size, because a lot of people point to that too. Even the chunk that they bring home is lower proportionally to other communities. And another thing that isn't mentioned is the funding that the state and the federal government actually gives to these very schools. And oftentimes, they're being misused. So that's another issue. And you mentioned the Catholic schools. You have to be clear that the Catholic schools in New York, the reason they oppose the recently revised guidelines is for a different reason. They don't want the local districts specifically to come in because they feel like in some rural districts there's competition between public schools and Catholic schools. Well, there is. I grant you that. But the Hasidic Yeshivas have a very different problem with these guidelines. They simply do not want to meet these guidelines.
No. Catholic schools, if I understand the position, they're not cooperating. And they are very nervous about the state, which runs the competition against them, coming in and setting. They have different guidelines. They teach different values and so forth.
Right.
They would not be as firm. They're opposed to this, and they believe that it's an intrusion on the 14th and First Amendment rights of people to choose schools for their children.
Well, you know, I want to get back to the legal perspective on this.
Is this heading to the Supreme Court?
This particular issue?
Or like New York, as it works its way through? Are we
this whole question of the school's responsibility to teach effective civics education, I hope is heading to the Supreme Court, because I just filed a case that has raised all these issues. But what I wanted to say on it is, it is very clear from the Pierce case that the state has the authority to make sure that kids are being prepared for good citizenship. And I suspect...
A lot of the question is how. And also, Anthony Kennedy, who had looked at those cases, did comment that they were decided largely on 14th Amendment grounds.
Yes.
That he could see the court moving on First Amendment grounds for this. I think we have a court that's much more religion-friendly than it has been in the past, right?
Well, that's true. That's true. And the case I'm talking about goes back 100 years. Right. But it is a very well-entrenched precedent. I can't see the Supreme Court
But the other part of that
that
case was that parents have rights. I mean,
yes.
What is the difference? Let me ask you this legally. What is the difference? They ruled that the private schools have rights and the parents have rights to have a private school, non-public education.
Right.
Okay. That back then, the effort was to say every kid has to go to public schools or this. It was a very broad thing. What's the difference between that and then coming in internally and setting the curricula and setting all the requirements? What's the difference? What would make it a private school if it doesn't have the autonomy to run itself?
I think what the court made very clear in the Pierce case, and I assume this would be the position if it comes up again in our times, the private schools can teach whatever they want about religion. There's no interference with the First Amendment. The only thing that case said is, in addition to teaching whatever you want to say about religion, the state has an interest in knowing that kids can read and write, and they can be effective citizens in our democracy, and that they learn about citizenship and citizenship values. And one of the reasons I'm concerned, you talk about standardized test scores, the scores in civics are much worse than math and English generally. Only 23% of students throughout the United States were proficient in the civics exam that was given by the National Assessment for Educational Progress. So we've got a crisis in civics education, and the fact that these schools apparently are not teaching this at all really worries me. We've got 100,000 future voters coming through these yeshivas. And if they don't know the difference between the powers of Congress and the powers of the president and all the other things that you need,
I'm sure they're all getting an education in the Constitution now.
Mr. Rebell's main argument is good citizenship. And who's going to argue that the kids that go to these private parochial schools are not great citizens? You know, the crime rate in our communities doesn't exist just about.
Well, here,
our kids are very much, when it comes to politics and who to vote for, and boy, are they sophisticated. Boy, are they aware.
Let me interject here.
So this is insane.
I'll give you the last word, but let me ask Michael a question. Here's the thing that worries like Catholic parents like me. My kids are in New Jersey. They're not in New York. But if you were in New York, you have the governor saying there's no room in New York for pro-life people. And then his education authorities are going to regulate your curricula stuff. That's a worry to me. And I think it's a legitimate worry.
Well, it is a legitimate worry, and that's why we have to pay a lot more attention to how civics is taught. I happen to believe,
But it's not just civics.
Who's going to decide?
Well,
who gets to decide, make the decisions on this?
Look, no qualified educator is going to say that you should inculcate pro-life, pro-choice, or issues like that. They may say that it's reasonable and, in fact, it's desirable to have debates on certain controversial issues among children in the school if the teacher knows how to conduct that in a neutral manner. And I don't think the abortion debate is
like
a
they
likely
do in
candidate.
public school. It's very neutral in public school, right?
Well,
I mean, when it comes to transgender, when it comes to a lot of other issues, it's about respecting our differences. It's about our respecting our differences.
That's exactly right.
And what teacher? You said qualified teachers. What does that mean? Who's going to decide the qualified teachers? Are we going to ask them what their point of view is? Are the teachers? Are the teachers?
A man who can't do math.
Civics. I want to say this.
Math,
good citizenship, civics. People going to college have no freaking clue what's going on.
Well, that's what Michael's point was.
That's my point.
College
you
students,
were just telling
they didn't
me
go to
that
yeshiva. They went to public school.
You're saying if they went to yeshiva,
our kids don't go to college.
If they had gone to yeshiva, they would have had good civic values. Well,
possibly as good at least as the ones they have now.
If you've never taken a course in American history, I'd be very skeptical how deep a knowledge you have about many of the political issues that voters have to decide in our country.
Well, we can do another show on that.
I'd love to comment.
Look, we'll do it. No. We're out of time. We'll come back. It's obviously a big issue. It's going to be going on. Naftuli, Michael, Dov, thank you so much for coming on the show. Please tune in tomorrow for the next deep dive. I'm Bill McGurn from the Wall Street Journal.